Hi, everyone. My name is Claire McKay Bowen, and I'm the lead data scientist for privacy and data security at the Urban Institute. And I'm really excited to tell you about my career exploration and experiences for this Women in STEM Leadership Symposium. So before I begin on exactly how I started on this journey, I'm going to explain exactly what my research area is. So I specialize in data privacy and confidentiality, which for most people, they don't quite understand what that means. So I'm going to go through an example. So a few years ago, there was an incident called the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook. And this was a situation where the Cambridge Analytica, which was a British political consulting company, collected personal data of millions of Facebook users without their consent by using an app that contained a series of questions to build like psychological profiles of each person. Now, Cambridge Analytica then used these profiles for political advertising for the 2016 United States presidential campaign and the Brexit referendum. People did not discover this massive misuse of personal information until a former Cambridge Analytica employee revealed it to the Observer and the Guardian, these newspaper outlets. And the public immediately demanded for data privacy reform, pushing for boycotting of Facebook. And basically, this negative public outcry forced the CEO of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, to testify in front of the United States of America Congress. And so again, this kind of brings the question like how should companies or any other kind of parties, including the government, should collect our personal information and for what uses, for how long, and so on and so forth, and how they should inform users of that. And so this is the kind of area of data privacy I'm working in is like how do we balance needs for using data in a safe and useful manner that helps benefit society while still protecting privacy of individuals. Now, this example doesn't highlight what could be the benefit other than it helps some company figure out how to be more targeted with political advertising. Um, we'll get to that in a moment because I'm going to actually do another example of like some of you might be thinking, well, that was Facebook. People willingly use their answer that app to give up that information. So what does that matter? Well, this is a screenshot from a New York Times article back from December of 2019 that talks about how just very few pieces of information with your personal identifiable information removed can make it still identifiable of that person. So what I mean by this? Well, New York Times actually did an example where they just had data where it was the time and the location of an individual with their cell phone. So there wasn't much else about that. You don't know the gender, we don't know the name, know anything else about this person other than where they're located, where they're moving about throughout the day. And they were able to track one person where they figured out, well, this person obviously works at Microsoft because they're on the campus between 8 or 9 to 5, kind of like working hours, and that they lived in locally around that area because of where they were during the middle of the night. So obviously where they were sleeping. And they followed this person's routine until they noticed like something interesting where that person was at Amazon at campus one afternoon and then proceeded to go back to their normal routine of being at Microsoft. And all of a sudden, that person started going to Amazon instead of Microsoft. So they found out that person actually did change jobs they were interviewing, and they were able to correctly identify the person. And they actually interviewed him for this newspaper article. And the guy said, "Yeah, I'm not too surprised that I was identified because there's so much information you can gather from just from someone's location." And so, from this point of view, you might be thinking, well, why should we be collecting this data? Like we already have the Facebook analytical scandal issue. We have now our cell phone information is being tracked. Like, why are we having this data available? Well, this kind of data is needed for instance, the contact tracing for the pandemic. It's actually one of the reasons why we weren't able in the United States to have wider use of contact tracing apps because of this privacy concern. This location data from smartphones are also used by FEMA to figure out how to navigate certain natural disasters like the forest fires we experienced last year in California and hurricane evacuation procedures. So this is the things where the data can be used for something very useful, but at the same time, we are concerned about privacy. And actually at the Urban Institute, this is where I'm trying to do is balance those needs of making sure that public policy makers and other researchers can use that data to make great social reform, but protecting those people who are in the data. So one of the data sets I work with is actually IRS tax data, because that data would be super useful to figure out how to be more targeted with these stimulus packages that were needed in our country. But it is still taxpayer data that has a lot of sensitive information, so we need to be careful about that. So that's the background of my research. So how did I get to this point? That's kind of like a obscured area. And so actually I started in my undergrad knowing that I wanted to work in science, and specifically actually I started in physics. I didn't actually add on my physics or statistics part to my degree because all I knew was that I really liked science and that I wanted to know how the world worked. So physics seemed to be the right choice. And I explored a lot of different physics projects. I worked in a biophysics lab, so the red and white blob looking thing is actually a protein I looked at using lasers. So that was cool. Lasers are awesome. So that was my biophysics project. I also worked at a health physics lab, which is actually the study of radiation on the human body. So that's why there's a picture of me kind of shaking up some samples. That was the health physics lab I was in. I also worked on physics education, trying to see like how can we teach physics better and how do people learn science. And so all these different research topics I worked on, I thought they were all cool. I really liked them, but I couldn't quite figure out which one I want to stick with. And this is actually why I went into mathematics and statistics, because I learned that mathematics was the language of science and statistics is needed in all the areas. And that if I was in statistics, I can work on so many different cool projects without having to be specialized in each one. And so that's why I ended up being focused on those other parts of my degree, and also the fact that it's important to have a support group. And so I'm really emphasizing this as a woman in science, is that if you don't have a good support group, it's kind of hard to fit in, especially because there's so few women in the area. And so actually there's a picture of my graduating cohort. I was the only woman in my physics group, but I had a lot of great friends who were very supportive and very kind and didn't treat me any differently. And so that was a really great environment to be in. There's also a picture on the right-hand corner with my mathematics advisor who encouraged me to pursue math. And it is great to see a female professor who is pursuing a heavily male dominated area, and to know like, oh, well, if she can do it, I can do it too. Like I can see myself being that person because I can see that representation there. So that's really important. And so this is actually why I started to pursue actually going into statistics, because again, with statistics, every science needs it. And so this was my way to still get to do all different cool sciences. And so some of that background is why going to the University of Notre Dame for my graduate degree. Well, that's a funny story. And again, this is to kind of explain my path. It was actually because of my spouse. So we were just dating at the time. He was my then boyfriend. And he was also pursuing physics. So he got his physics degree before I did, but then thought he was going to go to grad school and actually looked at Notre Dame. And so we were trying to optimize what was called the two-body problem, trying to, how do you balance two people's careers? And so I also applied for Notre Dame because I thought, okay, we got to maximize our chances. So we applied to a lot of the same programs. Turns out he didn't go to grad school. He ended up just getting a job. And I went to Notre Dame because I took a tour there and really liked the university. And so I went and got my master's and my PhD and specialized in that area of data privacy that I just talked about earlier. And during that time, I also did some internship programs because I was very lucky that the program I was at Notre Dame really encouraged students to go and get an internship, which is really important because that's going to help dictate like exactly what you want to do. Because at the time I thought I was going to be a college professor. That was what I was going to do. But I did an internship at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is a kind of more of a physics-based lab in the United States. And I really enjoyed my time there. I did more computational physics, and it gave me the side of like working in government that was kind of like hybrid of like a little bit of academia, it's a little bit of industry because you had to meet certain deliverables, so it felt like industry, but at the same time getting to do really cool research. And so this is actually a picture of me hiking because there's a lot of great hiking out in that area, and I just fell in love with it. So that was a great time. I also did an internship at the United States Census Bureau, which they focus a lot on data privacy work too, because they have to release really important data. You might have been surveyed last year for the 2020 decennial census. So they have to collect a lot of information, but they need to release it for public policymakers to do certain, make certain decisions, like how do they budgets or redo the redistricting voting lines is actually the kind of data that states need from this 2020 census that's coming up. So that's the kind of data I was working with during my internship, where I was trying to figure out how do we alter the data to still be useful but protect privacy of people. And during that time, instead of doing a lot of hiking, I did a lot of biking. And this is actually my favorite picture, where I hulked out in front of the White House, which I thought was just fun. And again, emphasizing how important it is to have a good support group. So I had wonderful friends that I developed great relationships with throughout my graduate career. And that's, again, really important, especially grad school is pretty rough. It's very isolating at times because you're kind of trying to figure out your research on your own, but you have to have a great support group, like other people to commiserate with, or having supportive advisors. So I have, on the bottom left is me and my advisor after the graduation ceremony, and actually on the right hand side is Laura Carlson. She was one of the deans at the university, and we bonded over the fact that we both like doing triathlons. So that was great to have that kind of mentorship through my graduate career. And then at the very top is all my friends who came to my defense, and this was right afterwards, and this was really exciting and it was a lot of fun afterwards. Not during the defense, it was actually very stressful, but glad that's all over. Now, what was my first job? Well, I decided to go back to Los Alamos National Laboratory and kind of try to expand my research a little bit, because when you go through your graduate program, you get very hyper specialized. And so in that area, I was all in data privacy. And I did a little bit of data privacy work at Los Alamos during my postdoc time there. But I did a lot of other things. I did more statistical computing and looked at like how we can use statistics with physics modeling. So this is kind of like some screenshots of some of the data I was analyzing, and it was a lot of fun too, because I got to learn a new area of statistics I never really researched about. But what ended up happening is during that time, I actually went and found a new job at the Urban Institute. So this is where I'm at now. And so I actually get lots of questions too of like, what switched you over to work in public policy? How'd you get to the Urban Institute? And it actually is another funny story. So kind of like how I fell into going to the University of Notre Dame because my spouse was like, hey, let's go here. And it turns out that's not what he ended up not going to grad school, right? So it was random chance that I found this job at Urban Institute. A colleague from a previous conference years ago that I kept in touch with, he emailed me saying, hey, Claire, have you seen this job? It's perfect for you. You should totally apply, which it did fit exactly what I do. It was looking at that area of data privacy, and they were hoping for somebody to work on that taxpayer project that I kind of hinted at before. And what this colleague did in addition is what we really need to help is support each other as women in STEM, is that he additionally CC'd one of the vice presidents at Urban Institute. And he said, hey, Rob, this is Claire. You should totally hire her. If she doesn't apply, you just should hire her anyway because she's awesome. And so that kind of endorsement was fantastic and actually set me up like much higher for this hiring process for that job. And I actually ended up meeting Rob at a different conference because I knew he was going to be there because he's really active in the statistical community. So I asked like, hey, let's meet up, let's talk about this. And it went from there. I ended up getting the job, and I've been enjoying in what I worked today. So yeah, it all really started by this random email. And so emphasizing yet again how important it is to have a good support group and to stay connected with people. And so now going into exactly what the Urban Institute is, you're like, okay, Claire, we know that something about public policy because you keep emphasizing this, but what else? Well, the Urban Institute is a nonprofit public policy institution that tries to, the tagline being, elevate the debate on public policy issues. It's a nonpartisan institution started by Lyndon B. Johnson over 50 years ago to be that like third-party entity to inform more data-informed decision-making for public policy makers. And so Urban Institute specializes in a lot of different areas. We have a health policy center, justice policy, tax policy, and so on and so forth. And so across these different centers, I actually help work with different individuals in them. I actually work in the tech center and the data science team. And so I try to help by doing consultations and just helping people understand like what are the privacy balance needs, and also working on these more targeted projects like that IRS one that I mentioned before.
So I love how you spoke about how important it is to have a really strong support system. So how would you recommend students begin the social networking process?
That's a really tough question because that's kind of like one of those soft skills of like, you can't tell people, oh, this is how you should behave when you interact with people. And so this kind of advice is just based on my experience. So I want people to understand that what worked for me doesn't necessarily going to work for them. I think one of the things you could do is find maybe like similar interest groups. I joined a women in science group when I was in grad school. So that was a nice way to meet people who weren't just in my department, but others, because the department I was in, at least in grad school, was very small. And so it was kind of hard to to make friends that way in that regard. In undergrad, I did the same thing too. I was part of a physics group, so I befriended people that way. There wasn't a lot of women, so that was a little bit hard. It was all men, but it was nice because they became my allies, and I think that's a really strong thing for women in STEM, is to make sure that you have those allies who become your friends.
Yeah, that's super great. This next question is just a little fun one. So what advice would you give to your high school self?
Oh goodness. So I know you prompted me this before, but and thinking about it, I thought, what would I tell myself in high school? And it's like, oh man, there's a lot of things that maybe would help, but my high school self wouldn't believe. One of them is to try to be more confident in myself. I think, especially for women, we tend to self-doubt ourselves or put ourselves under a lens to be perfect. Like we have to do everything completely to the T. This is actually something that you see with resume or job applications, that women will only apply to ones that they think they perfectly fit or close to fit, whereas men are more likely to like, oh, about half of them I satisfy, so I'll just go ahead and apply. And really that's what we need to do, is just put ourselves out there and just try to be confident in that. But that's easier said than done. Confidence doesn't, again, come overnight, and the same thing with the whole socializing aspect. So I don't think my high school self would believe me. She'll probably think, oh, that's crazy. I don't believe you.
Yeah, definitely. So growing up, did you have a particular role model who you always looked up to, and how did they shape you into who you are today?
So one of my role models that I had while I was growing up was my grandmother. She kind of ruled our family like a matriarchy, which is really interesting because I grew up in a very rural area of the country, and Idaho is actually in a farming community. And so there's not exactly a lot of Asian Americans out there. My grandmother, for some background, she adopted my mother, so she's actually Caucasian. So, but I never kind of saw that we were different or anything because she was my grandmother and I loved her. So there was that. It was like that unconditional support and just love, and basically saying that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And so I didn't understand that there were these inherent barriers because of my gender or the fact that I'm an Asian in a very white population. Like those things didn't come up until I started going to school, because again, my grandmother basically said, you could do what you want, like as long as you work hard. And she was also another role model in the sense of, I saw her doing so much charity work. She was like one of the most charitable people I know, because not just like, giving out money to like foundations or things like that, but every year we would have random people come and have Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner with us. Like she would invite people who didn't have a place to go. So it was very standard to have 50 to 80 people in our house, just like eating and hanging out. And like the conditions were like, oh, I'll provide the main course meals, but you guys bring all the salad, side dishes, and desserts. And so that I was just used to that, being kind of that kind of setting. And so, of course, when you're a child and you grow up with that, then like you go hear other people, it's like, well, why is your Thanksgiving dinner so small? when talking to others, but yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So what has been one of your most challenging leadership experiences, and what did you learn through that experience?
What was my most challenging leadership experience? I can't think of like a particular most challenging one. There was a couple that I guess came to mind. So one is I was leading a women in science group actually during my grad school years. And one of the challenging things is it's a volunteer group. So it's not like I have any supervision or like any like control over people, like incentive of like I'm paying you, or I'm like your supervisor who does your performance review for your job or things like that. It's so there you have to be kind of creative into encouraging people to make sure that they do what they're going to say to do, because like it is a volunteer organization. So one of my mindsets is like, well, you volunteer what you can, but sometimes people will say, oh, I will totally do this, but they drag their feet and they don't complete it in the time frame that they need to. So you just, like I said, kind of get creative in how you try to encourage people. So one of the things I did in particular, somebody said that she would deliver some gifts to our speakers that we hosted an event, and it's good to be timely with that, but it would have been almost a week. And at this point I said, like, she has them, like somebody already prepared the bag. She just needs to go and deliver them. It's not that hard. It's on campus. And so the way I kind of nudged her was I emailed the speakers and I CC'd her saying like, hey, thank you again so much for speaking at our event. CC'd here is this person. She is going to be delivering your gifts. Please let us know where you would like them to be delivered. And so that kind of put her on the spotlight. And it wasn't me being mean or anything. She said she would do it within the week, and it had been like the week timeline up. So that was my gentle way of trying to be like, hey, you need to get this done. So that was one of the creative ways for I guess leading an initiative. I guess another thing is that, and this is something that I challenge myself, or it's challenging for myself right now, is that even though I'm leading a lot of projects or leading different committees, I still have like self-doubt. And I think that's because, especially as a woman, you think, oh, I have to, again, going back to, we have to be perfect. And so I keep thinking like, oh, maybe I should have said it this way or that. And I just have to tell that inner person to be quiet and just keep going on. Because like, even if, let's say I did make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. You just have to keep going on and continuing what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last question is, what has been your biggest lesson that you've learned through your education and your career?
So that's very broad. And so I'll try to figure out a specific one. So one of the thing, I guess I'm just going to spin this into like, what is like a general lesson learned or something like a guiding advice. I would say to try to optimize on my happiness, which is kind of a funny way to phrase it, and maybe a little cliche because everybody says, oh, you should do what you love or things like that. I think it's harder to do that than one thinks, because you'll come to like crossroads in your career or in your education where you think like, well, the voices in society telling me I should take this path versus another, or maybe your parents are telling you, or some other people in your life who are saying like, you should do X instead of Y, but really it's your life and you should do what you want to enjoy to enjoy that life, right? I mean, there are of course like factors that will come to play, of course, like financial or family situations. Like one of my conditions actually, when I was trying to figure out some things in my career, was making sure I was close to family. And so one of the things I did was like in my current job, I negotiated to be a remote worker. Now we're all remote workers, but this was before COVID. But that was really important to me. And so that's something I pushed. And so even though that wasn't the best like career move, because they did want somebody who lived in DC to take the job, I still pushed for that because it was important for me to be closer to my family. So try your best, and it's hard, but I think that's like the most important thing you can do is, again, trying to figure out what makes you happiest.